Good evening. I'm Joe Carbonetta, and from the Pasadena Media Center, this is Arroyo Live. Our program is produced by Pasadena Media to help enrich our community through informative and meaningful conversation. Remember, you can share your comments with us anytime at arroyolive@pasadenamedia.org. For more than a generation, no one in the U.S. has talked about or even heard the word inflation. Most economists generally agree that the U.S. has enjoyed a rather stable economy for one of the longest periods in its history. In fact, we'd have to look back more than 40 years, all the way back to 1981, to find a U.S. economy in turmoil similar to the situation we now find ourselves facing. Fueled by factors such as shortages of goods and services, as well as staggering levels of unemployment, all brought on by 2 years of a global pandemic, followed by rapid infusions of cash to help stabilize and then revitalize the economy, subsequent massive job growth, and now a war in the Ukraine, which threatens to start the cycle all over again, the consumer price index has skyrocketed, up a massive 7.9% over just a year ago. That translates to big increases in the cost of food and rent, and that's not all. Gasoline prices have seen equally disturbing increases based on the continually rising cost of oil. While prices have gone up across the country, nowhere has the increase hit harder than in the state of California, where, for the first time ever, prices reached over $6 a gallon in some places. To try and curtail some of the CPI's increases, the Fed recently announced plans to begin raising interest rates, making money more expensive. But will that be enough? Tonight, I talk with some of our local experts about our economy, where it currently stands, and what may lie ahead. Please join me for tonight's edition of Arroyo Live. Joining me are Pasadena's acting economic development manager, Mr. David Klug, and Mr. Paul Little, president and CEO of the Pasadena Chamber of Commerce. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
I'd like to start out by talking about our economy in general. It has been suggested that the U.S. has enjoyed a rather lengthy period of stability in the economy. And recently, it has spiked, but we would have to go back almost 40 years to find something comparable. So, can we start out by just talking about the stability that we've experienced and the fact that basically a generation doesn't know anything about inflation?
I think there's a lot of factors. There has been some inflation, but the government's done a good job of sort of keeping a lid on it. But at the same time, salaries haven't risen, especially for those folks that really keep the economy going, the people on the low end of the wage scale. And so now we're seeing some inflation caused by a number of things, conflicts overseas, supply chain issues, just overall increase in costs, and those labor costs are going up as well. But, I think it's not something to set your hair on fire about. Necessarily, though I will admit that it's really tough to fill up the car and almost put $100 worth of gas in the tank. But it's part of what I think we all maybe need to adjust to, at least temporarily, until things settle out. It has been a very wild couple of years for not just the economy, but individuals everywhere. And this is, I think, another symptom of all of the issues that we've been facing since mid-March of 2020.
Something that gets talked about when we see a situation like this is recession. And often people are confused because what precipitated the situation that we now find ourselves in is a suddenly booming economy. So it's hard to imagine how, when things seem to be going so well, we could be looking at the verge of taking a massive step backwards. Could you explain that in more detail?
I can offer that, Joe, that a lot of investment is still willing to come into Pasadena. We have a lot of companies looking to grow and expand here in our city. In terms of the inflation, I think what Paul touched on a little bit earlier is absolutely correct. And that we have enjoyed a prosperous economy for the past several years. And in terms of course, the retail and the office and the hotel markets all took a dip and a bit of a hit over the past couple of years. But from what I'm seeing in my job is a lot of those sectors of our economy are in recovery mode. And in fact, heading toward pre-COVID levels again.
And that's part of it. And I think, the government, by keeping interest rates really low and other things, has kind of artificially kept the inflation rate down. And so, now we're suddenly seeing, inflation happen. But at the same time, our economy is growing at a rate that we haven't seen in a long time. You know, it seems contradictory, but really, with the economy growing, at least nationwide here, I think we'll see some adjustments, but I also think, things will level out, and that it will get under control to some degree. And I do think, I mean, Pasadena has, even in the worst of the pandemic, fared better than some of our neighbors, and at least as well as others. And in part because we do have a very diverse economy here. The obvious, folks took a hit, but at the same time, other segments of our economy were going very strong. And Dave's right. Pasadena is a city that people want to invest in. People want to be here, even when you have, a hotel go bankrupt in Pasadena. We've got folks stepping in to buy it and get it started again fairly quickly. So this is a place that does attract investment, which is a good thing, and which will, hopefully, stabilize our economy and get, Pasadena back to, at least whatever normal is going to be.
Well, oftentimes when you talk about investment, most people will think of property as a good investment. People place investments in the purchase of a home. That, of course, takes money, and a lot of our economy has historically been based on credit. There is a term referred to as the cost of money, which is in itself a strange term to think about. You think about money and then money would have a cost, but that generally refers to the lending of money and the interest rate that comes along with it. And with that in mind, over the past several years, the cost of money has been very low. We have seen historically low interest rates, and that has led to a boom in the housing market. How much of a factor was that in the sudden upswing in our economy, and in the longer term, this sudden cost increase that we're seeing?
It's figuring property values are subject to lots of factors. I'm lucky. I bought my house in 1986. At the time, our interest rate was 10.25%, which I think helped keep the price of the house down. When I finally paid it off, I was at 3%. But the value of my house was, 10 times what I paid for it in 1986. I think that the property values and the interest rates are a bit tied together. If interest rates go up, to 6-7%, I think we'll see property values at least stabilize and level off to some degree. But it's very hard to tell. The especially residential home buyer right now in Pasadena is not what the residential home buyer was when I was buying my house in 1986. It's partly because of the cost of the properties. And the same thing I think is true of commercial properties. They were, incredibly valuable to us. Seemed to be very high prices. Although if you're in Singapore, you'd think that's a laughable amount to pay for a building, because internationally costs are very different. But I think the interest rates will play into all of that to some degree. But at the same time, there are investors who want to be in Pasadena because values go up and because properties are the inventory is essentially stable. It's not growing significantly, and that also keeps values up. Supply and demand, it really does work.
Well, certainly we have seen the values of properties in areas like Pasadena go up incredibly high in relation to even some of the surrounding areas. Is that going to be a concern in the coming years as interest rates increase?
Again, it's hard to tell. Dave may have more insight into the sort of basics of the economics of it.
Yeah, I mean, but it's, when I don't really track residential properties, I'm looking at the commercial side of things, Joe, and what companies are doing to come into Pasadena and how much investment they're willing to make. And as Paul indicated, the inventory is, I mean, it's there, but for example, General Motors just announced that they're bringing their advanced design studio from North Hollywood to Pasadena. And they are investing millions of dollars in this facility to bring in those new jobs and do business in Pasadena. So they're looking to invest somewhere between $70 to $80 million in our city. So in terms of the residential and the home prices, I really can't comment on that because that's not my area of expertise.
And I monitor it because I'm a homeowner here, and when a for sale sign goes up down the street, I'm always curious to see how much they're asking a square foot. But that's purely a self-interest endeavor on my part, or at least curiosity.
And I too am a homeowner, and to go out and buy my condominium again that I bought in 2013 would be a completely different financial picture. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. And I think, and residential real estate and commercial real estate, the inventory is very stable. They're not even, even though it seems as if there are a lot of new units being built, the number of residents, especially single family homes in Pasadena, is essentially static. And that means basically that prices will likely not go down much.
And there's a lot of apartments being constructed. If you up and down Walnut Avenue, for example, you could see lots of units being added to the inventory.
Well, you mentioned a moment ago that General Motors is making a massive investment in the city of Pasadena, and in fact, they're abandoning an earlier site in the Los Angeles area for that. What is the reason for this move?
It's the expansion. They found several buildings that comprise a campus at Sierra Madre Villa and North Rosemead, and the opportunity came along for them to make that investment. I think they also look at the workforce around Pasadena, given that the Art Center College of Design is located here, and a lot of their graduate from that art center will end up working at General Motors, their design studio. That's where they design, kind of the future car, and that's kind of their niche. And Pasadena luckily has the Art Center to supply them with would-be employees. I'm not saying every Art Center graduate would go and work there, but GM looks at things like that and says, that makes sense for them to invest in Pasadena.
And it's not just Art Center, although that has a lot to do with it. Art Center, pretty much every interesting car you've seen designed over the last 20 years or so has had some Art Center grads hand on the way it looks. But we also have JPL here, and we have Caltech, and we have other technology companies, and what they do is also playing into why a company like GM wants to put their future car design studio here, because it's more than just tires and a look, but also the stuff that goes inside and makes it run. And that's getting much more complicated and technical. And a lot of those technology components are, are influenced and reflective of what happens, on Mars, for example, but also the workforce at JPL and the folks that are going to be designing the technology in those new cars have similar experiences and similar educations. So I think they looked at that as well. And a long time ago, somebody relocated their company here back in the I think the late 1980s, early 1990s, and we asked why they put the company here. He said, Pasadena's cool. It really is.
It's a well-known city with an international reputation.
Mm-hmm. And you won't find a nicer place to live, I don't think, anywhere in Southern California. Our downtown is clean, safe, lots of things to do right here in town, and very easy access to everywhere else in Southern California. So, I think there are a lot of logical reasons why, both because of what they're doing, but also because of the community they're moving into.
You mentioned, of course, with the new businesses coming in, that would be a potential increase in jobs for the immediate area. But we were also talking about the cost of money. Recently, we have seen many businesses raising their rates of pay in order to try and remain competitive as they seek to fill new job openings to try and keep pace with the booming economy. But again, the cost of money is such that as the consumer price index increases and things become more expensive, the more money you may make, it doesn't go as far as it used to. So how do consumers keep pace with this current increase in the cost of living?
There isn't a lot that you can do about it. I can't, stand in my front yard and scream about inflation and have it go down. We cope, and everybody has to cope. I'm lucky that $100 tank of gas isn't going to mean that I have to go without lunch. And I hope that's not the case for anybody. You hope also that the increasing wages will at least somewhat offset the increase in the costs of things. It's going to have to level out at some point. And there's only so much safety net for people. So I think, it's kind of, seems harsh to say, but hopefully, the increase in salaries that some people are seeing will help with the increase in costs they're facing. And the hope is that what the federal government's doing and the raising interest rates and other things, and hopefully freeing up supply chain issues will bring some of the costs under control and maybe back down.
From the
somewhat.
city's perspective, it's our job to set the table for the employers to come into the city to provide opportunities for those who are looking for employment and to better themselves, as Paul alluded to.
With that in mind, is it likely that we will see the rates that employees are paid continue to increase to offset the continuing increases in the cost of living?
Yeah, that's a bit of reading the tea leaves, but I think one of the interesting things that we've seen as the places have opened up and employment opportunities have come back, is that employees are are able to ask for higher salaries and other concessions
Benefits.
that they may want, benefits, but also, the remote
Mhm.
work, shorter work weeks. I've got, we had to furlough everybody in our office for 18 months. We were all 2 days a week not being paid, and not working. But we went back full time January 1. Two of my employees asked to stay part time. Which sure, does help my bottom line a bit. People I think are realizing that there's more to the work week than sitting in an office staring at a computer. And they're asking for not just more pay, but conditions that are more attractive to whatever lifestyle they may want to pursue. So the workforce and the workplace are changing in a lot of ways, and that's one of them. Employers are having to, in a lot of cases, adjust to the wishes of their employees in a way that they didn't have to do a couple of years ago.
But how much of that contributes to the massive increase that we're also seeing in the consumer price index now? Certainly, as an employee, if I go to an employer and demand a higher rate of pay, uh, basically with the bargaining chip that you need me because there aren't enough workers to fill all the spaces, and the employer is then forced to capitulate and pay that increased amount of money in order to remain competitive. Doesn't that employer then have to pass on the cost to the consumer overall of paying more for the employee by raising the cost of the product that they're outputting?
Yeah, but the hope is that the consumers have also seen an increase in their income. And a lot of what we're seeing right now, uh, as the causes of the increase in inflation, a very small part of that is the cost of employees. It's much more, I think, a factor of the supply, the supply chain issues, the lack of enough product, and things like oil and gas costs, and the lack of computer chips for cars, things like that, are driving prices up because it's keeping inventory low, and that's just the nature of the way that things work here. There is less gas, so it costs more.
And it takes time from when the cost per barrel of it, the oil barrel drops to make its way to the gas pump itself. It doesn't happen overnight.
Well, speaking of the increasing costs of fuel, there's been a lot of finger pointing recently as to what the actual cause of that has been, and it has been suggested that the oil companies are simply profiteering with the fear of supply shortages brought on by the war in the Ukraine. How much of this is actually artificial?
Oh, that's impossible to say.
I sorry, I don't really have an answer for that. I agree with Paul. That's good question for the oil companies.
And there are issues in California with a couple of refineries being out of production, and California having a unique formula for gasoline that no one else has. The situation in Ukraine is much more dire for Europeans and folks in South Asia than here. We don't import oil from Ukraine, but it's an international commodity that gets priced based on international supply. We also have other issues. There was a glut of oil a few years ago, and the price dropped so much that companies capped wells. So it's hard. There's less oil being taken out of the ground at any given time than there was 6 or 7 years ago. in part because of that as well. So there are a lot of factors, and I'm sure, somebody somewhere said, well, let's see what the appetite for expensive gasoline is among Americans. Because the other reality, quite honestly, is we're still paying half of what they're paying anywhere else in the world for a gallon of gasoline.
Well, a moment ago we were talking about the pandemic and how that really caused a global slowdown economically. Um, but bringing it more local, at least here in the U.S., certainly we saw as a result of that stagnation, a lot of cities filing for bankruptcy. Uh, what is Pasadena's current situation and their financial outlook?
Again, I'm the economic development manager. I'm not the finance director. And for me to comment on that would not be appropriate, I don't believe. But I know that we'll have a balanced budget. I know that what I see again in terms of commercial business activity is very robust. So their financial credit rating and so forth, that's not a question I can really address appropriately.
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, going back to, that Pasadena has a diverse economy, that means that no, we're not going to suffer necessarily as much as others may, who rely on a fewer number of industries to prop things up. That also, I think, for the city means that while, income from sales tax, I'm sure, is going to be lower, other income the city gets is may even increase. Property tax, for example, if I sold my house, the property tax on my house would be 10 times what it was when I paid for it, and probably 5 times what I'm paying now, because of the way property tax works in California. And there are other income sources, including was it 17 or 27 million from the feds that the city got to help maintain services and employment, for the city. So, and to credit the city as well, they had been building up reserves for the past 15, 20 years. To get to a level where if there wasn't an emergency, the city would be able to deal with it, which I think we saw them do. The city was able to, support the Rose Bowl debt service
And the sales tax increase also helped weather the storm as well.
Well, I realize that this may call for pure speculation on your part, but based on the idea of this economic diversity that you speak of for the city of Pasadena, is it fair to assume that LA County is probably in a similar situation, that economically they are poised to do all right through the next coming years?
The entire county, they had different. Let me put it. They have different challenges. LA County is enormous, and their income sources are different and spread much thinner than they are here in Pasadena. I talked about Pasadena being livable. The other thing that Pasadena is relatively manageable because of its size. We're not the city of Los Angeles, and we're certainly not LA County. So I think it's a bit different. I do not expect that LA County is going to default on anything, nor do I think LA City will. I think they're managed well, and certainly would avoid any kind of significant defaults. But they may all be looking at the county and LA City and our smaller, bigger neighbors, and Pasadena as well, at least looking at what's the income and what are the expenses and how do we make that match. I think that's an exercise everyone that's an exercise government at every level is going to have to deal with. The feds can print money, nobody else can. So I think, there are gonna be some adjustments, even in Pasadena that, as I said, is doing, relatively well compared to others in similar circumstances. There are gonna be adjustments, and I think we might as well face that. And I think, in a behemoth like LA County, those adjustments are going to be larger, just because of the size of the county operation, and how thinly they're spread. So I think, it's a very different animal, and I'm not knowledgeable enough to say, well, I think the LA County is going to have to cut this, that, or the other thing, but I think we're going to see belt tightening everywhere.
Well, and speaking of that and making adjustments and bringing it a little bit more local back to the Pasadena area, what can residents do in Pasadena to improve their financial stability over the coming years?
To improve their own. Well, I think honestly, if you want to, support the economy locally, support the local businesses, that can help. And the more business the local coffee shop gets, the less likely they are to have to raise prices, because they can make up in volume what they would have had to made up in cost increases.
I would agree.
You know,
Quiet locals, but we always, preach.
Yeah, we used to collaborate on a shop
Shop
Pasadena campaign over the Christmas holidays that sort of was on hiatus for the pandemic, but that really is it. If you want your local economy and your neighbors and yourself to do well, keep your money as close to home as possible. It's not possible for everything, but there are a lot of things you can get here locally from locally owned and smaller operators that are competitively priced.
Would you call that part of a recession prevention plan?
I think it's a city preservation plan, to be perfectly honest, and a neighborhood preservation plan and a household preservation plan. I'm lucky. I live a mile and a quarter from my office. I live in Pasadena and work in Pasadena. But I think, part of what can keep Pasadena being the city that we all really appreciate, and the greater Pasadena area, it's not just Pasadena, is keeping our money as local as possible. You can't do it with everything. Pasadena doesn't have its own phone company, for example, but that phone company does pay taxes here. On every dime I spend, I think a penny of it is coming to the city from my phone bill, and my cable bill, and my electricity and water and all of that stuff. And I think that helps. There's a percentage of sales tax when I buy something at Vroman's bookstore. There's a percentage of that sales tax that stays here in Pasadena, so it doesn't just support Vroman's and their employees and the folks that publish and write the books they sell, and everything else, but it does support the city as well. So my sales tax money is also making sure that my trash gets picked up. It's important, and folks don't necessarily think about it that way. But sometimes, it does matter that we stay within the borders of Pasadena when we're spending, our discretionary income on things that we can spend it on here in Pasadena.
Well, another cost increase that we have recently begun to see, and it's one that's really across the board, affecting not only residential but commercial properties as well, has been the increase in the cost of water and of natural gas and even electricity. Is there a plan to offset any of these massive increases? Certainly, in the case of water, some of it is driven by the ongoing drought, which, as the years progress, seems to be getting worse. There's a similar energy crisis when it comes to electricity. What can be done to offset these cost increases? Obviously, something that can help the commercial sector and maybe trickle down into the residential.
Well, from a commercial point of view, the city does have a program for certain construction tax waivers for research and development companies, and we also have a wide range of power and water and power rebates for the commercial properties and incentive programs. In terms of the residential, I really can't speak to that in terms of there's an offset at all. There's not that I'm aware of, but only on the commercial properties.
Yeah, and the water and power department does, I could call up and have someone come out here and do an audit of my water use and check my system to make sure I'm not wasting water or electricity as well. Part of, another, good thing about being here in Pasadena is that the electric company and the water company are essentially owned by all of us who live here. And so they are somewhat responsive. But in the case of water, Metropolitan Water District is going to increase the rates it charges. And we get 60%, 55% of our water from them. Pasadena is pushing back on the rate increase, saying we don't want to pay this. But that's not necessarily going to prevail. And if we want the water and want to continue using it, we are going to have to pay for it, just like everything else. But there are, put solar panels on your roof. Make an investment now to ensure that your electric rates are stabilized or lower because you're generating your own electricity.
Even that, that's kind of a vicious cycle, though. We have seen in recent years that the power providers are beginning to cry foul because of the increase in the use of solar electricity as the cost of the systems has come down and government subsidies have afforded more and more people the opportunity to begin investing in solar power generation for their homes. The power companies have seen a reduction in the amount of power that they're selling. And as a result, they are claiming the need to increase rates of electricity in order to maintain the operational status of their system. How do we reconcile that kind of a problem?
Well, especially with the PG&E and Edison, the big investor-owned utilities, there are so many factors that go into their costs, including, PG&E is going to have to pay tens of millions of dollars because of fires they caused in other parts of California. So it's not just the solar. And in fact, they're all trying to generate more themselves so they can sell electricity to their customers. It's the nature of the way those things work. I'm not saying it's fair, but that's just kind of the way things are.
They've also recently gone before the PUC to lobby to reduce the amount that they pay back to consumers for generating excess amounts of electricity and that being fed back into the system.
Well, and they're also trying to reduce the amount of subsidies that are being paid to people who do put solar on their roof.
So in essence, it almost seems like there is very little that the average consumer can do to offset these cost increases, because no matter what steps you take to try and reduce your electric usage, the response is that the companies are increasing rates at an even faster clip.
Well, the rate increases for utilities in California are very highly regulated, and it is a very a steep slope they have to climb to get that. It's not an automatic pass through in a lot of, at least for the big utility companies. And so people can, people can do what they can do to conserve energy or find alternative uses or find alternative sources. Or, there's been a movement lately for municipalities to get together and consolidate into what amounts to their own utility company, so they can get some control of rates. partly the nature, partly the nature of a system that allows for monopolies on things like water and electricity. Um, uh, but I don't know how you fix that.
Well, and the rate increases pay for upgrades to the systems as well. Nobody likes turning on their water faucet and not have water come out. I mean, people need to understand, I think that, and again, I'm a Pasadena resident and a consumer as well. Yeah, the streets get torn up, but new stuff is going in. It's not as if the monies and the rates are being collected and just sitting in an account and not doing anything. Lots of water and power projects are happening as a result of the increase. Just look around in our city and you can see where all of the construction is in the streets and the roads. So infrastructure upgrades are needed.
Yeah, and the difference in Pasadena is that there aren't shareholders getting a percentage of, what I pay in my bill. The shareholders are the citizens of Pasadena. So, it does go back into the system. The reality is, I have sat on the planning committees for both water and power. The reality is they're more than a century old, each of them, and a lot of their infrastructure is too, and needs to be upgraded. I do not want my electricity going out on September 15th when it's 112 degrees in Pasadena. I'm too spoiled by my air conditioning. And so there has to be an investment back in the system. That's just the way it, we all really need to kind of face that. And there are programs, the city of Pasadena has programs for folks who are challenged in paying those bills. They do have programs for low-income people to help offset the costs of electricity and water.
A moment ago, we were talking about the rising costs of housing. And Paul, I believe it was you that mentioned that this is precipitated by a relatively low supply of available housing. Dave, you also mentioned that there are a lot of apartments that are currently under construction in the Pasadena area. And again, this is concerning ourselves only with the local issues. But there has also been quite a bit of pushback about the expansion of these apartments in the Pasadena area, especially since many of them are designated to be for lower income housing. That creates its own set of challenges. What would you say about all of that?
The zoning and the planning kind of codes allow for a certain amount of build out within the city. It's in our general plan. The properties that I referenced on Walnut that are going up, many of those projects were entitled, in other words, the right to build 2 or 3 years ago, maybe longer. And they all seem to be coming out of the ground at once. And that does seem like there's a big boom, but the developers went in and bought the properties. They went through the process to get the permits. Yeah, it does create challenges. Then again, there's no secret. There's a housing crisis in California, a shortage of homes for people across the board. And as our housing director always says, if you want to solve the housing crisis, you have to build more homes. So yeah, it's a huge problem that we're not going to solve today.
Yeah, and I think the other thing to consider in all of this is that even though we've seen a lot of what seems to be a lot of building downtown, the population of Pasadena has not increased very much over the last 15 or 20 years.
It's held at what, 140,000?
Yeah, I think we were at 142 at one point. I think we're back down around 140, and I think 20 years ago we were at 132,000. So we're not seeing a huge increase in the number of people, and there are lots of reasons for that. But I think there is a need for housing. A lot of the housing that's going in is market rate housing, but we have in Pasadena inclusionary zoning, which requires a certain percentage of the housing be affordable, and affordable is not low income necessarily, or that they pay into a fund that creates affordable housing. And, right now, affordable housing is, is working class and middle class housing in a lot of cases. Because it's impossible if you're on a, you know, relatively normal salary, even, a good college educated white collar salary, it's almost impossible to buy a house in Pasadena, because of the cost. So there is a need for housing. There is definitely a need for housing at almost every income level here in Pasadena. And the best place to put it, quite honestly, is where the services are, where the amenities are, where people can get to the grocery store, restaurants.
The Gold Line.
Yeah, yeah, all that stuff in downtown, which is what the general plan envisioned. It's almost 30 years ago now. Wow. But that kind of works. And um, the housing's being built because people want to live in it. People want to live in it because they want to live in Pasadena, and they want to live in a Pasadena that has housing for them, and places they can go and things they can do within close proximity to where they live.
Well, and building on that, earlier we talked about Pasadena, and it was mentioned that it is an attractive city for people outside of the area. I believe there was a reference to the coolness factor of the city. With all that in mind, there's certainly a large tourist element that brings financial resources to the city. All of that probably slowed down significantly as a result of the pandemic. Are we seeing it return to pre-pandemic levels, or is there a hope that it will return to or even exceed pre-pandemic levels?
We're seeing a little bit of a hope to return. We're not quite there yet, but we are seeing gains in that sector. As Paul mentioned earlier, there was a closed hotel, and if we're talking about the same one, Paul, on Colorado, I think we are. We have new investors for that hotel, and that will reopen in June, and they are going to invest more money in the hotel and reopen it. So that's a good sign. It's also a very good sign that the city was able to host the Rose Parade and the Tournament of Roses Rose Bowl game. So that's also an indication of tourism returning, but we're probably looking somewhere late 2023 to come back all the way. Is what we're hearing and reading.
People, and it's not that people don't want to travel, but I think people are still reluctant in a lot of cases to take the risk, even though the risk is smaller now because of vaccinations and all that. We did have the New Year events, and thank you, Tournament of Roses, for that, but the crowds were down, and as a result, revenue was down as well. But Pasadena was still out there putting on those events, the tournament, and all their volunteers and the city and everyone who pitches in.
And the trade shows and the conventions are also picking up. And speaking with that group, Mike Ross and the convention center are seeing an increase in demand and more shows coming to the convention, and larger shows at that.
Yeah, I think one of the things that, we talk about the sort of hospitality and tourist industry, but I think one of the real challenges is going to be what happens with business travel. Business travel would put a lot of people in hotel rooms in Pasadena, and a lot of people in restaurants in Pasadena during the week. And it's something we're going to have to really watch, because I think a lot of companies have realized that they don't need to necessarily do all that traveling to have meetings now that we're all used to Zoom.
Program is a perfect example of that, as a matter of fact.
Exactly. So that's, I think, even more of a consideration, and I think that's one that the travel industry as a whole is looking at. I'm somebody who I've been on 34 airplanes in the last year, and I'm going to be on 6 more at the end of this month. I got vaccinated and I'm traveling. And it's actually worked out for me. But in a lot of cases, people are very reluctant to not just get on airplanes, but go stay in hotels and eat in restaurants and places they're not familiar with.
But we are beginning to see those numbers peak back up and creep back up, I should say, closer to the 2019 fourth quarter hotel occupancies, retail vacancy rates. They're all starting to trend back in the positive direction.
No, that's good to hear. The hotel industry does contribute quite a lot to the city and the quality of life here through income and on visitors,
Jobs.
taxes they pay. So it's important. I think there are a lot of things that we need to watch coming off of the worst of the pandemic restrictions. Office. The occupancy rate of offices is going to be something that's going to have an impact if significant number of companies are are exploring hybrid in-office work from home models. That's going to have an impact on all of those folks that make money on selling lunch to people who work in offices, for example, and the dry cleaners who, are used to office workers dropping things off in the morning and picking it up in the afternoon a couple of days later. So that there's a lot of impact from that we're going to have to really pay attention to as well, and see how the office worker, at what rate they return and how often and in what capacity.
Again, those are inching closer to, fourth quarter 2019 numbers and levels and percentages. The office vacancy rate in the fourth quarter 2019 was 11%, and Q4 2021 numbers are 13%. So, and we are seeing a lot more leasing activity come into play, which is very encouraging.
Another sector that was hit very hard beginning with the pandemic was small businesses, once considered the bread and butter of the Old Town Pasadena area. Certainly when the economy came to a screeching halt as a result of the pandemic, a lot of those businesses literally withered on the vine and died. Now, with the possibility of continued increases in the consumer pricing index and the dollar not going as far as it did, a lot of businesses are poised to be hit hard again. Does Pasadena have some type of a business retention plan or recruitment plan to bring in new?
Well, we do. We talk to a lot of our businesses. We haven't been able to do them lately, but we do host breakfasts to get together whether a certain sector of the economy, whether it's the office, retail, the restaurants, the professionals, the attorneys, the engineering group, to sit with that group, listen to them one-on-one, hear their concerns. And of course, we want to keep and retain as many businesses as we can in Pasadena. And sometimes it's just a matter of communication and hearing their needs. And I'm sure Paul could speak to this as the chamber president. He probably hears a little bit more than I hear firsthand. But in terms of communicating with our businesses, we do these breakfasts. Well, we're going to start them again in May, and we do them every quarter, so we can reach out and listen and hear the business's concerns. And for Old Pasadena, yes, some have closed in Old Pasadena, but others have, again, reopened new stores, new concepts. And I am encouraged by the activity, the leasing activity that I'm aware of and that I see. And I think we're heading back, toward the pre-pandemic levels is the data that I at least see and know about.
Yeah, the biggest challenge in the pandemic really was those small locally owned businesses and certain sectors that just got shut down completely. The fitness and yoga studios and those folks. I think we're seeing we saw closures, obviously, and we heard, a lot of harrowing stories from business people in Pasadena. I think people are a bit more optimistic. But the other thing that's happened is people are looking at very closely at their revenue and expenses. And, we're seeing restaurants that are not open at lunch anymore because it didn't make financial sense for them to do that. And some places that are closed or that have, changed their business model a lot. There was a big move to online sales for people who shunned that previously because it's the only opportunity they had to reach customers. So there have been a lot of changes. You can't look and say, well, this industry's gone or this one's crippled. Small business people are incredibly tenacious. And it's a financial investment, but also an emotional one and a time commitment to run a small business, and they don't give up easily. So,
And with the restaurants, city did implement the outdoor dining in terms of the, buying the barricades, buying the safety equipment, allowing the restaurateurs to put tables and so forth in the street, streamline the permitting process to get them open as quickly as possible. And as Paul alluded to, restaurateurs are very adaptable, and they really pivoted more toward takeout when they were closed, but takeout became an option. And now outdoor dining is really the other option that they pivoted to as well.
Well, gentlemen.
And
Oh no, please go. Please finish.
No, I was just going to echo a little bit what Dave said. City staff here was extraordinary throughout the pandemic in the way they stepped up to support the business community in Pasadena, especially the small businesses. The restaurants are an obvious example, but there were so many things across the board that happened to either reduce costs for businesses or support them and allow them to either expand or reach new markets in very cost-effective ways. That came from the thinking of city staff people in a lot of cases. And I think they really need to be commended for the support they gave to the business community here in Pasadena and the local economy by being creative and by, not looking at the way things have always been done and thinking, how can we make things more successful now? So that's, a credit to the city and the staff and the city leadership as well in Dave's office.
Thanks, Paul.
No, it's true. It's true. And I think you deserve a lot of credit. And I think there are a lot of businesses that are open that may not have been open otherwise. And the other good thing is that a lot of the innovations are going to continue into the future because the realization that, so much is going to rely on takeout, for example, that restaurants don't necessarily need the parking and they can put tables on it. Things like that. So I think, there'll be a shift in that sense back to something, but it won't be back to what we had experienced regulation wise in 2019, for example. And I think that's a good thing.
Well, gentlemen, I'm afraid we have run out of time. Mr. Paul Little, Mr. David Klug, thank you both for joining me this evening and for sharing your insights on this current economic situation and what's to come.
Thank you, Joe.
Joe. It's always nice to see you too, Dave.
Thank you, Paul. Same to you.
For our viewers at home, if there are topics you would like to see addressed on this program, you can email them to arroyolive@pasadenamedia.org, and we may include them in a future broadcast. Until next time, this has been Arroyo Live. I'm Joe Carbonetta. Thank you for watching, and good night.